Welcome everybody. My name is Amanda Martin and I am the President of the National Education Union. Before I introduce how we're going to run today, I just want to run through some housekeeping on our secondary reps Zoom call. So firstly, we are going to be recording this so that it's available for those that aren't able to listen in now. Secondly, if you have a look in the chat aspect, there is an NEU behaviour code which we like everyone to adhere to when we are doing online Zooms. Thirdly, this is a webinar Zoom call, therefore you'll only see the panelists and the people talking and not yourselves. However, we do want you to be involved as much as possible in this call. So there are two functions that you can use to do that. One is the chat option, which I can see many of you are saying hello in, and that's brilliant. That's what we want you to do. So there's the chat function where you can put in comments, you can say hello to people that are making comments, but also it's where our tech team will post links that we're talking about and really good bits of information that you can use throughout this call. And the other area that we want you to be interactive with is the Q&A button. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the questions and answers and not in the chat. In the questions and answers, put your name and where you're from and write your question, please. And then our tech team will sort those out and make sure that they're delivered to me once Kevin and Mary have spoken. If you can wait until Kevin and Mary get towards the end of what they're saying before you start posting, because they may well answer some of your questions as we're going through. And I also want to recognise our amazing signer today, Sam Riddle, and also the panel of tech team, which is Vin, Craig, Nikki, Mark, Mike and Amy today, and they will be supporting you both in the chat and also in the questions and answers. I think secondary reps, I want to say thank you for joining us. And I know since lockdown, many of you have not only been relentlessly working, but it's been confusing and worrying. And we know that schools since lockdown have had over 300 bits of guidance, which is just it's crazy and very, very irresponsible of the government. But we also know that you have been giving constant support to our members and your members in your schools. And for that, we want to say thank you before we say anything else. So thank you very much on behalf of everyone in the NEU. And I'm going to pass over to your Joint General Secretaries, Kevin and Mary. Thank you. Could you unlock them, please, Mike? Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, all the reps on the call. I'm Mary here with Kevin. I'm the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, and we're delighted that you're all on the call this afternoon, and we hope it will be helpful and useful to you. Now, today, the government had to draw back from its announcement that all primary school children would be going back to school before the start of the summer holidays. The fact that Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, had to go to the House of Commons and make that announcement just demonstrates the very chaotic approach that has taken place with the whole issue of schools reopening. It is a humiliating day for him. And we think that's happened because the government has not acted in the way that other countries have acted in planning about school closures and schools reopening. So we're often compared with Denmark, and Gavin Williamson has said we're mirroring Denmark. That's simply not the case. Denmark closed down schools much earlier in the pandemic, went much earlier into lockdown. It's had a far lower proportion of headcount of people getting the virus than the UK. When the school returns were planned, the infection rate was much lower than the UK. And all the plans, both for closing schools, but crucially for reopening schools, were planned in detail with the Danish Teachers Union. And this is something that in the NEU, we have absolutely said to the government, work with us, let us work together, and let's have an ordered, phased, and a successful reopening of schools. The government hasn't done this. And the result is today's announcement, where they've had to withdraw from an announcement that they never should have made, because it should have been clear to them that if they were following their own guidance on social distancing, on deep cleaning and on the requirements for opening schools safely, they would never have given, even as an aspiration, that all primary schools should open to all pupils before the end of the summer term. We don't believe that the government's approach, which essentially has been leave it to school leaders to make the decisions, has been successful. This is not what happened in Denmark. In Denmark, the government decided with the unions and with the local authorities when schools should reopen, The school's risk assessments had to be signed off by the local authority health and safety officer, who visited the school, every school that was reopening, to ensure that what was written in the risk assessment actually was the case in the school and on the ground. And don't need to look at Norway and Denmark. We can look at Scotland and Wales, where the approach has really been different, where the Scottish government and the Welsh government have worked much more closely with the unions. There is much more consensus and much more professional and parental support that the governments in Wales and Scotland are approaching this reasonably and rationally. Our government today has really reaped the whirlwind of trying to go it alone, trying to ignore local authorities and trying to bypass the education unions, and in particular the NEU. So what we want to say today is the key issues and concerns that we think you as secondary reps will really want to consider and take forward as we plan for schools to be, secondary schools to open on quite a limited basis from June the 15th. And now I'll hand over to my Joint General Secretary, Kevin Courtney.
Thanks, Mary. I want to say, I think it's important to say that we have been aiming for the moral high ground throughout all of this. So we encouraged our members to be in schools, and most schools were open to the children of key workers, and our members have been supporting children, providing online learning for children at home during this whole period. And the drive of the union has been to keep communities safe and to keep individuals safe. And having said that, talking specifically about the secondary school situation, the government guidance now is that it wants secondary schools to begin reopening more widely from June the 15th. There isn't a requirement on any school to open from June the 15th, but the government does want schools to open from June the 15th. But it has to be safe as well. And if there's something on the checklist that's not in place, then the school doesn't have to open. When they are talking about reopening, as Mary says, and as you already know, it's quite a limited reopening to 25% of year 10 and 12 in the building at any one time. That 25% doesn't include the key worker children, vulnerable kids who are already in, but the 25% is a limit on the number of year 10 and 12. And that means, and the government is clear about this, that remote education is going to continue to be the predominant form of education delivery for these year groups and for all the other year groups. And so the government says that should be high quality, and we agree with that. The government says that schools have the flexibility to implement face-to-face support for year 10 and 12 pupils in the way that best suits their circumstances. So we have to think about how to use that flexibility. We think that schools, if there's a choice, should prioritise those who've been not engaging in remote education and disadvantaged pupils, and trying to get those back for face-to-face contact if the school is opening. And those pupils could attend more frequently, as long as only a quarter of pupils are back in school at any one time. The full-time provision for vulnerable and key worker children still has to be maintained. And if those kids are in a bubble, the school should explore how to bring them back into their normal school year groups, but that has to be subject to risk assessments so that we're not spreading the virus too much if it's there. Schools can use rotas, and many schools we are hearing, for example, are talking about bringing a quarter of year 10 or year 12 back for a week at a time. So a quarter of the kids in 1 week, another quarter in the following week, the third quarter on the third week, etc. And that allows, we hope, for socially distanced classes. A quarter of 30 is 7.5, so you can get social distancing in a classroom with that sort of distance. And we think the 15 thing that they talk about doesn't allow social distancing. And we think social distancing continues to be very important in stopping the spread of the virus. And while there is sometimes discussion that children might transmit the virus less than adults, there is no definitive proof of that, and government scientists don't claim that there is. And when we're talking about year 10 and year 12 children, we aren't talking about children. So even if it turned out that there was some reduction in virus transmission for younger children, we wouldn't expect that to be the case with these children. So social distancing really matters. schools will also be looking at staggered start and end times in order that to minimise the use of public transport at times when it's got any degree of crowding, and also to try and ensure that children aren't mixing outside the school gates and therefore potentially transmitting the virus. So looking at staggered starts to try and get children in and out in that sort of way. We're talking about this term, but we're talking about much longer than this term as well, because although the government doesn't say it openly, although it started hinting at it in things that Matt Hancock has said, it's clear that education is not going to go back to normal from September unless the virus clears up much better than everyone expects. We think that, and the government is planning on there being disruption right through the autumn term and maybe even beyond that. Conversations with ministers from other nations in the UK makes clear, and there's better conversations in those other countries, that they are planning for contingencies, including a second spike in the autumn term. So there's so much variation in the expectations of what happens in the future, so much variation between regions now. It's really important that we stay in touch, that the union has to respond, has to change its advice from time to time because the situation changes outside, and it all tells you there's going to be a mixed picture for some time to come. In many areas, local authorities will still say that secondary schools shouldn't open on June the 15th because the case rate is higher in many areas than in other areas.
Thank you, Kevin. So already some reps on this call are saying, what should we look for in terms of risk assessments for the reopening of secondary schools? So it's important for you to know that the NEU, along with the JMB, Unison and Unite, has produced a secondary checklist for reps to complete with school management before any school reopening. So you reps, will you please download the checklist from our website and make an appointment to meet your school manager in charge of health and safety and go through the checklist with that manager. Now the items on the checklist is not as long and as detailed as primary because the conditions around secondary are different, and there is more emphasis on social distancing, etc. at secondary. So the provisions for primary and secondary are different, but the checklist is still very extensive. It's very detailed. We've got stronger. It's actually taken from DfE guidance. So what we've done is taken the DfE guidance and turned that into a checklist, adding stronger measures on social distancing and stronger measures on protection for vulnerable colleagues and those who live with vulnerable colleagues. So we'll say more about those colleagues later. So as reps, this is what we want you to do. We want you to complete the checklist. We've got a digital app actually as well. So you can, I'm a paper person, I like bringing a checklist into the room with me. But those of you who are whizzo at technology, we've got a digital app which you can fill the checklist in. And that's really good for us because what that means is we can have real-time information about what is happening in schools, how schools are complying with the government guidance, but also where there are problems and where they're not complying. So when you complete the checklist, that will identify the areas in which the schools need to plan and need to do actions to make the opening safer. If you can't agree with the school manager about the checklist and about what needs to be done, then we've also got escalation guidance on the website about how to then take that discussion forward. And we are urging everyone to delay a wider reopening of schools unless all the items on the checklist can be fully complied with. So if you are unable to agree a compliant checklist, get your members together, get a virtual meeting of the NEU members in the school and get all your members to sign a model letter, which is on our website, to send to your head, which essentially says, these items, these issues have not been addressed, and this has been identified by our checklist, and therefore this school is not safe to reopen. If your school still plans to go ahead and open on the 15th of June, and the collective view of your members is that working on site remains unsafe, and you've used the model letters, then, and you're still getting nowhere, then inform your local branch. The details of your local branch and your contact details are on the back of your membership card, or ring the regional office and ask them for further guidance. Your local branch may well be holding a Zoom meeting to discuss wider opening in your area. So if that's happening, we encourage you to join that Zoom call, because it's a really good way of learning what's going on in schools in your locality and getting support and getting to know people in your area. And it's also true that local branch officers will know your school better and will know what's happening in your school. They'll know some of the personnel, and they may well be able to intervene if you're encountering problems. Now, the NEU is a family, and we want our members to be confident and assured and to have a voice and to speak up for themselves. And we think the checklist is a really essential document. It's a really essential tool to enable you as a rep to get the conversation going with your school management about a safe, wider opening of your schools on the 15th of June and beyond that.
Thanks, Mary. I hope that most of you have seen that app for doing the checklist. I see some people asking, where is it? Most reps have been sent an individual link to it. There's been a couple of problems with the membership system, so not all of you have yet had it. We're sorting that out, but there is a link that's just been put in the chat about that. I'm going to now talk about vulnerable staff in the wider view of them, and about Section 44 that you may have heard about, quite a famous now bit of legislation. So in terms of vulnerable staff, we think about safety as far as schools going back in two different ways. There is something that is thinking about community safety, trying to ensure the minimum transmission of the virus, which is keeping the whole community safe. And in many ways, that's keeping 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds who've got nothing to do with the school safe. And we do that, we've been doing that by delaying, by pressing the government to have contact tracing up and running, by ensuring that there's social distancing in schools. All of that is stopping the general transmission. And then we also want to think about protecting individuals. And we know that there are different vulnerabilities. We know that age is a huge factor. For every decade you go up, you get much more risky. The highest risk of all is people who aren't teaching, 80-year-olds and 70-year-olds, but 60-year-olds are at a significant risk, and 50-year-olds at much more risk than 20-year-olds. So we know there's a huge variation with age. There's also that huge variation with comorbidities, which is the biggest problem. If you've got diabetes, then the outcome of a case of COVID could be very bad. And then we also hear from the Fenton Review that we were pressing for the publication of the increased risk to black and ethnic to black people as well. So just going through those sorts of categories, we think of them as 4 or 5 different groups. The extremely clinically vulnerable. This is a government definition, and those are the people who should be shielding. And we don't know of any cases where heads are trying to get extremely clinically vulnerable people to come back to work. It would be really mad. So if you've got any, tell us about that. Then there are the people who live with extremely clinically vulnerable people. And the risk there is not to that person, but the risk they take it home. And again, we don't hear of heads who are saying that those people should be back in school. Then we reach the clinically vulnerable, not the extremely clinically vulnerable, but the clinically vulnerable. Again, this is a list the government puts out. It includes pregnant women. It includes people with moderate asthma. It includes people with diabetes. The government says that this group of people should refrain from contact with people from outside their household. The advice changes from time to time, but we use that phrasing, refrain from contact with people outside your household, and the other general government instruction that you should work from home if you can work from home. And we think that those people, and we think about 12% of our members come into the extremely clinically vulnerable or the clinically vulnerable category. Now, there's plenty of work for 12% of people to be doing from home because there are so many children at home. So we think that completes the circle. These people should refrain from contact with people outside their household. They should work from home if they can, and there is work to do from home. So we are negotiating that those people are at home making their contribution. That should be easy. We sometimes hear of some heads trying to force people back. We heard a case recently of a 64-year-old who has moderate asthma where the head was asking, it's a person who's a TA, asking that person to be back. It's astonishing. And we push back on that and the heads accept it. The place where we have most difficulty, but where we generally win, is the people who live with clinically vulnerable people. And again, our argument is the same, that there is much more risk to that clinically vulnerable person if they get it than to other people. So given that there are children at home, there is work to do from home, we think those people and their families should be in that category of being allowed to work from home. We think the same thing applies to people over 60 and to Black people who are not yet 60 as well, given the increased risk. And what we're urging is that we see this as a collective thing in schools, that it is not for every member of staff who lives with a vulnerable person, or for every Black guy who's 53 and really worried about the situation, or for every 62-year-old. It's not for them all individually to make the case. They might well need to say to the head that they're vulnerable, but we want the rep to be able to have an understanding of what the school group is like, where people are at on that, and to negotiate with the head that there is a way of these people making their contribution from home. This doesn't have to be for all time. If the virus level continues to drop, then the risks get less and less. Of course, the virus level might go up, but if the virus, and then everything else is thrown up in the air as well. But we want to make this a collective job in schools. So we want you to support the individuals in sending the letter and to talk about it with the school group and to raise it with the head, that these people who are more likely to have a negative outcome, and that might be death, or it might just be being in hospital for a very long time, because these people get hospitalized more as well, that where we can, we get them to make their contribution from home. And we know lots of stories of reps who are getting that from head teachers as an agreement, and sometimes through talking about the fact that other staff were not going to go in because it's unsafe, and they talk about section 44. So that's why I'll now come on to section 44. Section 44 of the Employment Act 1996 offers legal protection to workers who refuse to work when there are questions of safety. And section 44 protects those people from detriment or dismissal. Section 44 is protection from detriment. Section 100 is protection from dismissal. And those protections apply if the person is a health and safety rep who's carried out duties in association with being a health and safety rep, if they're a safety rep and they're performing functions of a safety committee, or if an individual works at a place where there are circumstances of danger where the employee, and I'm just reading it out, reasonably believes there to be a serious and imminent threat which they cannot be reasonably expected to avert, and therefore they've left the building or refused to come into the building. So if there is a reasonable belief of a serious and imminent danger, section 44 is a protection. Now, obviously in any legal words, there are always ways around those words, but they have a real meaning, and they can really be used to protect people, and they can really be used in conversations with head teachers. So those phrases about serious and imminent danger, we're helped by the fact that the Coronavirus Act that the government put forward describes the coronavirus as a serious and imminent danger. So if there is a threat of the coronavirus, that can be a serious and imminent danger. So section 44 is useful in some circumstances, but it is not a get out of jail free card. You have to be able to show a reasonable belief in these matters. It doesn't have to be a threat to you personally. So you could say, if the school is making vulnerable people be in who might be in real danger, then I am allowed to say, I think this is unsafe and I am not coming to work because of that. So there are ways of using it to protect other people as well as yourself, but it's important, and it's important when we talk about this, that it cannot be a central union call. It's not a get out of being able to take industrial action. So it's an individual that says, I think there's a serious and imminent danger, and therefore I'm not coming to work and I'm going to rely on the protection of this. Now, those individuals might be making those individual decisions after a collective discussion arising from the discussion of the checklist, from the questions of whether vulnerable people are in work or not. And we have had situations where we have talked about Section 44 and where, as a result of that, head teachers have changed the decision they're making. And that is really important. We are not looking to do Section 44 in order that people refuse to go to work citing Section 44. Instead, we're looking to talk about health and safety and ensure the head does the right thing in the first place. So if there is an item on the checklist that you are not satisfied about, that members in your school are not satisfied about, then it's something to say, we think it's not safe, head teacher, because the checklist isn't fulfilled. And if we think it's not safe, then maybe we won't come to work if it's not safe. So you're always going to try and get the change. And in terms of the checklist, our checklist is about social distancing and it's about vulnerable people as well. So you can use it in those, it's a tool that it's a protection that an individual member who believes it to be unsafe for themselves or others can rely on. But it is not a get out of jail free card. You need to have that reasonable belief. And we think that by and large, it's much more sensible to use that about local school matters, about checklist matters, about social distancing proposals, about the proposals around vulnerable people, than contesting the general government guidance where they say it's safe and we're saying nationally, well, we don't think it's safe. It's not as likely to work in those circumstances as the circumstances about finding something on the checklist or something about social distancing or something about vulnerable staff that makes it much more local.
Thanks, Kevin. And we know that there's another group of members, group of staff who feel particularly vulnerable in this crisis. And we know that black staff feel particularly vulnerable. We know that they are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Now, we know that age is the most significant risk factor. And we know that when age is combined with other comorbidities, then that is even more risky. But the Fenton review shows that black people are nearly 2 times more likely to die of COVID, given similarities in age, given similarities in comorbidities than white people. And we know that men are affected worse than women. So we produced a fact sheet, which is on our website, coronavirus and coronavirus crisis, what you need to know about racial disparities in COVID-19. So if you are concerned about the issue, there is that fact sheet there for you. We've also got new guidance on the website today about vulnerable staff, very detailed new guidance about vulnerable staff, all the different categories of staff who may be vulnerable for whatever reasons, very clear guidance about what to do if you feel that you are vulnerable or that you are living with somebody who is vulnerable, and how to approach how you should organise your work and how to approach school management, with letters and guidance to support that. So that's new on the website today. We know that black staff in particular are more likely to work in schools which serve deprived communities, and we want this unequal level of risk to be taken into major consideration within the government's response to coronavirus and its plans to suppress its transmission. We're engaging with the DfE on evidence of racial disparities and discussing with DfE advice about specific risks for black staff. So black staff who have an underlying health condition or who are being pressured into work rather than working at home should speak immediately to the NEU rep or contact our advice line. We have a letter on the website that these staff can use and can send to their head teacher. And it's important that we all see the protection of vulnerable staff, the protection of black staff, the protection of those who live with vulnerable relatives as a collective issue. There will be many pupils at home for a long time. So there is work to be done at home, supporting these pupils' learning. And remember, these protections won't need to last forever. If the government runs the crisis better, then the number of cases will fall and it will become progressively safer to work on the school site.
Thank you, Mary and Kevin, for some really detailed... Oh, sorry, you coming back? Sorry, Kevin.
I've just got a couple more lines, Amanda.
No,
just to say that we are working on guidance urgently around blended learning and around all of these issues that will come up this term, and they'll come up in the autumn term. And that guidance will concentrate on the question of safety, that the minimum number of staff at any time that's necessary should be in school, the minimum number of staff meeting with pupils, those are all contributions to safety, that we have to have fairness in the blended learning. We are concerned, as you will be, that it'll be disadvantaged families who are least likely to send their children back. And that'll partly because disadvantaged families are often living with people with comorbidities or in multi-generational households. And so we have to think about how we are supporting those children at home. So we can't have all the learning in school, and we have to be able to support children at home as well. Mary said the Scottish Government are working on lots of guidance around blended learning with our sister union, EIS. We want the Westminster Government to do that with us. So not all staff will be able to go back, and these are all things about fairness. We need to be realistic. Social distancing and splitting classes will not mean that education can be the same as it was before lockdown. I've seen a number of questions coming in about exams next year. We don't think exams can be run in 2021 the way they were in 2019. We'll come back to that in some of the answers. But we have to be realistic about what's achievable in these situations.
And the key thing we have to be realistic about is teacher workload, because it was already far too high before the crisis. Teachers work more unpaid overtime than any other profession. And we're very aware, and our members are telling us this, that wider school opening has the potential to increase workload greatly, because teachers will be in school teaching and then required, if this isn't thought through properly, to be preparing lessons for blended learning and distance learning. So we've really got to be clear that if you're teaching in school, that's your job. If you're doing blended learning and online learning, that's your job. You can't do as much teaching as you did before and do blended learning on top, particularly as we know that online learning takes so long. It takes much longer to do. Lessons take much longer to prepare. So we've really got to keep our eye on that people are expected to do even more hours than they currently do, where we work so much longer than most other professions. So that's really what we wanted to say. We hope that's been helpful, and we're really interested in your questions now.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the interruption, Kevin. I've got a number of questions coming through. Some you may well have answered, so I might skip over them as I begin, just in case. So I've got, first one is from Austin, and he said, Williamson said, exams will happen next year. Can this be challenged if we don't have enough time? Then a question from Harvey. What do we need to consider in terms of risk assessments, etc., if our school is not due to wider open until September? And Richard, is it true that around a third of all students will be asked to return before September in Wales? If that is the case, is that likely to happen in England? And I'll give you one more. Jonathan in Enfield. My school is planning to invite Year 6 students and their parents into school next week for transition days. I've told them this is contrary to DfE guidance and gave the relevant reference, but they're planning to go ahead anyway. What else can I do? I have checked, and as far as I know, no other secondaries in my local authority are planning to do this. So that's those three just to start with. Thank you.
So shall I start with the exams?
Yes, please.
If we take it turn and turn about, the exams question, Williamson has said that the exams will continue, but we know and will continue the same as they should have been the same as they were in 2019. They didn't take place in 2020. Listen, the government said that all primary school children had to go back before the end of the summer term, and they've had to retreat from that. They're going to have to retreat from GCSEs and A-levels, as they were taken last year, will be taken next year, simply because already many young people have missed a huge amount, well, not a huge amount, but a significant amount of teaching time. We know that these young people have had different access to learning and different access to resources. So some will have done a lot of the work you set, some of them will have done very little, and that may not be their fault. They may just simply be in houses or where that's not possible, or they may not have access to the internet. 700,000 young people don't have access to the internet from their homes. So we're in discussions with Ofqual and the DFE about their plans for exams next year. Nothing is set in stone in these discussions, but we're pushing at the issue of learning loss. So if they do happen next year, the exams, they can't look the same as last year's. There'll need to be conversations about slimming down the content, and actually there'll need to be also conversations about a much wider range of questions. So the bits of the syllabus that this cohort have learned and have been taught, they've got a chance to answer what they know in the exam. Nothing set in stone yet, but Ofqual are engaged in very, very detailed guidance about that. And it's clear that something is going to have to give. And we won't be doing the qualifications in the way that were done last year.
Thank you. Kevin.
So I'm going to answer the question about, from Harvey, what do we need to consider in terms of risk assessments, etc., if our school is not due to wider open now until September? And I'm not quite sure whether what this question means in some ways, because the government's communications this morning I thought were particularly confusing. So there were press stories saying that secondary schools wouldn't have any wider opening till September, and that was not a reference to this opening on the 15th to one quarter of year 10 and year 12. That was a reference to there being no further opening than that before September. But on the other hand, in some areas, head teachers have agreed they're not moving to open on the 15th, sometimes because local public health directors, who are in conversation with NEU branches and with local mayors or local councils, have urged that they don't. And partly, sometimes that's because the case number is much higher, and the case number is much higher per 100,000 in the northwest and in the northeast than it is now in the eastern region, etc. So there are those variations. So the risk assessment is something, the risk assessment we've done now is focused on these periods of reopening now. It is useful for September, but we're going to have to look again before we get to September, because we do not know at this stage what the government is going to be saying about how many kids come back in September or what the wider thing is. I think they don't know that yet, because it is going to depend on how they manage the virus across the period between now and then. It may be that the summer holidays leads to case numbers falling, then they have their contact tracing really up and running, and then it's working, and then they'll, they might be a bit more, they might want a few more kids back, or it might be that they haven't got it under control and we're not moving any further forward. So we'll have to partly look at those risk assessments and how we develop this one for September time as time goes on.
So Richard Bannister asked, is it true that around a third of all students will be asked to return before September in Wales? If that's the case, is that likely to happen in England? Well, what we know about Wales is that from the 29th of June, Kirsty Williams has said that all year groups should return on a phased basis, and that there should be no more than a third of pupils in the school. In September, beginning in September, the intention is that the autumn half term in Wales will be expanded to 2 weeks. And in each school will be a phased approach with year groups split into cohorts with staggered starts, lessons and breaks. And again, that no more than a third of pupils present at any time. Is this likely to happen in England? No, the 4 nations of the UK are not following the same guidelines. At present in England, it's year 10 and year 12, and we don't expect that to be widened before the beginning of the summer holidays. What will happen in September in the return, the government, Matt Hancock said 2 days ago in Parliament that he didn't know what was going to happen, and I suspect they still don't know what's going to happen. As Kevin said, that will be contingent on how the pandemic is playing out.
Thank you.
You asked me to answer this question from Jonathan in Enfield. His school is planning to invite year 6 students and parents into school next week for a transition day. Jonathan knows that other schools in Enfield aren't doing that. He's told his school it's contrary to DFE guidance gave them the relevant references, but the school is planning to go ahead anyway. What else can he do? So, I mean, I think it's worth saying that I think Year 6 transition into secondary schools is an important matter. And if I had my way, I would have thought that Year 6 kids going back to primary schools was the thing that the government should be concentrating most on in socially distanced ways and at the right time and later than they're doing it. And then maybe teachers from secondary schools going into those to talk to them so those kids have seen at least one face from the secondary school, easier in some areas than others, depending on how many feeder schools, etc. there are. I think Jonathan, having alerted his school to these things, I think, I don't know where to go on it actually. You could talk to the local authority about the fact that the school you think is not going with the guidance. And I think Jonathan's a local officer, so he might have the roots to do that. If that fails, then I think it's looking at the question of, are they going to be socially distanced when they come in? How is that going to be run? If you get all the Year 6 kids and all the parents turning up, then I think that's very hard to do. So looking at those questions might be a fallback position to look at on that. But I think the school's getting this wrong. We should be getting the primary schools, will be getting kids in. And I think that's a better way to look at it than the kids coming to you from all the travelling that they're going to have to do to get there.
And I agree with Kevin, and I think that actually a risk assessment needs to be done on this project, this idea. And if a risk assessment doesn't meet the criteria, then it's not safe. Because it's exactly like you would do a risk assessment on opening your school up on a parents' evening, on a school opening to come and show your school off. So you should absolutely be doing one for this as well. So I think that's a way to go, because then you've got some concrete questions to be asking. Okay, I've got some more questions here. So I've got Jane Bassett. What is the view on live lessons and recorded lessons? Lots of staff seem to like them, but others have raised safeguarding issues and so on. Also raised the issue of equality, given the access to IT is highly socially divided. And then a question from Harvey. How much marking of work is advised for teaching online lessons, please? And from Nick, should we now be looking to form safety committees in schools so that all staff have the ability to be involved in deciding safety matters? And one more for the moment from Lynn. The R rate in the Northwest is above 1. What is the NEU position on schools in the Northwest opening? So 4 questions there.
So should I take the one on online learning? Start that one. Many teachers and schools are using online learning, and they're using that to connect with children and to young people and to support them. We have got guidance on distance teaching and learning for secondary teachers on our website. So do go to our website, go to the secondary section, and it is there. We do, we're not against online learning at all. We've been unfairly characterised against online learning. That's not the case. But we do think that live lessons can be a problem because teachers are at home with their own children. Not all children can access that at the same time because because of the limits parents might be using the computer. So we think the recorded lessons are better because all children can access those if they have the internet and they can get that, rather than just the video is good for some. So we're certainly not against online learning, but we're saying recorded is usually better. It's safer for you and it's more accessible for your pupils.
Thank you, Mary.
Amanda, I'm going to ask you to remind me of my question in a second, but I just want to say before you do that, General Secretaries don't have all the answers, and I'm looking in the chat and other people are giving good answers to the question that Jonathan raised. People are saying that their schools are organising virtual tours for Year 6 kids and teachers going around with cameras, etc. And other people raise the question of what the insurance, ask the head what the insurance is, if they are going, and they are going specifically against DfE position on whether schools can reopen it. A secondary school isn't allowed to go to a wider opening before the 15th of June. So, and this school is also getting it wrong in terms of the DfE guidance, and that could have questions around the insurance. Amanda, what's my question? Sorry.
The question was around how much marking for online marking should be expected. That was one of the questions. And the other one, which I think is fairly easy to answer, is should we now be looking to form safety committees in schools so that all staff have the ability to be involved in deciding safety matters? So I think both of those
you answer that one, Amanda. And
well, I think yes is the answer. Collectivism is exactly what we need to be having in schools, and we need to have as many people trained up. I spoke to a branch and district secretary today and suggested that they ask their officers to go on the various sectional Zoom calls that we've got going on. So our sixth form, our independent, our leadership, so that there's a collective voice in the branch and district, and the same should apply in schools. Because if there's more of you, then it's going to be better. And also, not just in the NEU. Our guidance is with other unions, and although the NASUWT isn't within that unions, their guidance is very similar. And in schools, we should be working together.
And indeed, we've had thousands of people who stepped forward as NEU reps in the period of this close down, COVID reps. And then we've also in primary schools where we haven't had a rep and we've asked people if they would volunteer to do our checklist. We've had another 2,000 checklist monitor volunteers as well, and there's plenty of space for more health and safety reps as well as health and safety committees. On the question of marking and how much is expected, this is a question that we need to be bargaining, negotiating about, because it mustn't be excessive. We want these kids to be learning, we want to engage with online learning, but there's got to be a balance. If you're in school engaging with the kids all day, about how much you can then do at home, especially, hopefully, when we've got some vulnerable staff who are at home, who can do some of that online work. And then we just really need to be thinking about what is a reasonable amount of workload and having that as a negotiation with the head teacher. And what we have been doing in many schools in the run-up to lockdown is really getting marking loads really coming down in schools where members have stuck together on it. We've got rid of triple marking. We've reduced the marking load. How you give children feedback in this situation is something to talk with your members of your school group about what is the way of giving some feedback to children who are at home. So we are trying to engage them in learning without making a rod for your back that you can't sustain. So we'll do more work on guidance on that, but we'd really appreciate feedback from you on what sort of arrangements you're getting in place on those questions.
Thank you. There was one question outstanding, which I'll put to both of you, and there's a second one that kind of follows with it, and that was just the one around the R rate in the Northwest is above 1. What is the NEU position on schools opening in the Northwest? And a very similar, along the same lines, is from Jan. When, if at all, do we envisage the 5 tests being met? I mean, we're not scientists, but either of you want to take those?
So the 5 tests, they're met when we're not in control when the 5 tests are met. So some of them, one of them, which we put forward, which is that there needs to be a whole school isolation policy if a member of staff or a child has COVID. That has been met by the government. Some of them are being met more recently than they were previously. So a low number of infections, but others are still some way from being met. So the alternative to the lockdown, we said, was a really good contact, test and trace system. We know that that is not going to be in place and up and running for a considerable amount of time yet. And there is still a real problem with the national system linking with the local system and getting that up and running. And the number of cases still is very high to enable a contact, test and trace system in place. That's really the important one, because if you're not going to do a lockdown as a means of suppressing the virus, you do need an excellent contact, test and trace one. And the Prime Minister says that we're going to have a world-beating one. I'm afraid at the moment that's in the long list of the Prime Minister announcing, but not delivering on a key element. In terms of the Northwest and the increase in the R rate, if the R rate's above 1, then schools should not be opening. They just should not be opening if the R rate is above 1. That is because once the R rate's above 1, then the danger is that the virus will increase and will increase rapidly. And we know that schools, we know this from independent stage, we know that schools, have potential, particularly secondary schools, to become sites of asymptomatic transmission. The children and young people may not get it badly, but there's no evidence at all that they can't pass that on into the community and back into families and start raising the R rate very quickly. I was on an international seminar quite recently. The WHO estimation is that closing schools suppresses the virus by 15%. If you open schools, particularly when the R rate is above 1, then they can become major vectors for transmission of the virus. And so so that test hasn't been met. And we don't think that test, a contact test and trace system, will be met for some time yet.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I've got some more questions. Ben Lee from Norfolk. If someone is classed as vulnerable but is insisting on coming into work, how should the union, indeed the school management, deal with this? Ian Walsh, what is the union's view on drop-in observations or remote lessons? I think we could give that one. Veronica Riley, how will we have staggered timings when thinking about numbers of directed hours, or due to the situation, do we not have a limit on directed hours? And two more. Paul Busby in North Yorkshire, given the changes in the requirement to now wear PPE in some public places, and given that the DfE advice contradicts this for schools, what advice would we be giving to members when faced with students and staff pressure to wear PPE when in school? And the last one, this is for you, Mary. Sam McKeed, Ofsted surveyed parents about when they are to start inspections. What's the NEU's view on the time for starting Ofsted inspections? Want to start with that one, Mary?
Yes. So Ofsted shouldn't be conducting any inspections ever on its current inspection framework. I mean, the idea that Ofsted is an agency which should be inspecting the quality of the curriculum, when it doesn't have any, when the person coming in to inspect your curriculum quality probably has never taught your subject and has no degree in it and has no expertise in it, is laughable. And this is an agency which has been through 4 inspection frameworks in 5 years as it desperately tries to find a role for itself. So Ofsted shouldn't be in schools in its current form. Ofsted should particularly not be in schools in its current at the moment. The fact of the matter is, schools are not going to be able to offer a full curriculum taught in a way that they've been traditionally able to teach, with pupils in the classroom in schools on a permanent basis for many months. This is not education at the moment as we know it. We're going to have to find new ways of teaching and learning, new ways of supporting students. It's going to look very different. And frankly, Ofsted has neither the expertise nor the personnel to do it. One thing I would say to Ofsted is, if they want their inspectors to come into schools and work with teachers and support staff and work alongside them and do the teaching, then we're very, very welcome. And that's a very good job for them to do. But the idea that they should be inspecting at the moment is just for the birds.
Thank you.
I'd take the two about vulnerable staff coming in who want to come into work, and about the directed hours, perhaps.
Yes.
So on that, the question of vulnerable staff, I think this is difficult. Our position is, and the government's position is, that people on that clinically vulnerable list are supposed to refrain from contact with people from outside their household and to work from home if they can. But people do have different appreciations of their own level of risk, and they've got different appreciations over what the level of virus is in their particular area. So I wouldn't want to get into a row with a member who said that they were going to come in despite the fact that we think they're vulnerable. The head teacher might want to do that, but I think that's more the head teacher's role than the union rep's role. We should be saying to the head, we want an agreement that no vulnerable person is required to come in, that nobody who lives with a vulnerable person is required to come in, nobody over 60, black staff who feel at risk shouldn't have to come in. But I don't know, people answer in the chat, but I don't think that we should then try and get between somebody who wants to come in. I don't think that should be the rep's role. The directed hours question, I think that we have to recognise there is a bit of a national crisis and show a bit of flexibility, but that doesn't mean in any way giving up on directed hours or having a longer day than you would normally have. If there is some if you can reach an agreement with your head about staggered entry times, which means that staff also have staggered entry times, then working that through is something that I wouldn't be against. Although I think most schools, when they do this, they will not try and do 9 till 3:30. They'll have staggered entry and leaving times, but with a compressed day that isn't that long. And I guess that's the pattern that will be in most schools. People aren't going to be going, I mean, when you've got a quarter of the kids back, you're going to be talking to them about work that they're going to do at home for the rest of the 3/4 of the time when they're not in school, rather than trying to do direct instruction. It's going to be supporting children's learning outside, and that doesn't take the same length of time. So a bit of flexibility, but not giving up the 1265 and not going late into the evenings or early mornings.
And the one about the, what is the union view on drop-in observations of remote lessons? That is ridiculous. It is completely ridiculous. The idea that teachers using new platforms, new technologies, teaching in new ways can be subject to lesson observations by senior managers, that is just ridiculous. And that is definitely an issue which needs to be raised, challenged and negotiated about. It shouldn't be happening. You know, we're asking people to use new technologies and work in new ways. And the idea that you can then use lesson observations as a basis for making decisions about pay progression, well, that's just no way to treat colleagues who are really working very hard. If you're doing an online lesson, good on you. You're doing your very best, teaching in a way that is completely new and quite alien. And the idea that you should be observed about that and then graded is just ridiculous.
Thank you. There was just one question left on the PPE, and I think that we've had argument on both sides of this, particularly some staff saying they want to wear it, some staff saying they're forced to wear it or being asked to wear it, and the government's guidance is extremely woolly, to say the least, on that. So I guess, do we have an NEU position, or is it something we need to look at with regards to the guidance that's being set and today's changes?
Well, the government, we have looked at PPE, and it's something that we've raised with the government repeatedly. The government guidance is that the key thing for schools is to have very clean schools, to have social distancing, to have hand washing, to have teachers not moving around the school and not meeting lots and lots of different children every day, and to keep children in and to keep young people in bubbles. That is the guidance. I think if people want to wear PPE, teachers want to wear masks or support staff want to wear masks, they should be allowed to. If they feel that is going to make them feel safer on the school site, then that absolutely should happen. And but we've been advised that the sort of PPE that you need on a COVID ward, you don't need in school. Having said that, you look at the photographs from Japan and you look how the Japanese children are with the visors over their eyes and their face masks. So the science in this may evolve. But I do think that what we have been assured that what is most important is the guidance which schools should be following, particularly hand washing, distancing, deep cleaning and social distancing.
And I think this PPE is just another example where the government's messaging is so unhelpful to anybody that wants to have common sense about it. So you heard Matt Hancock talking about it on the radio the other day, why it has to be worn on public transport, because you're in an enclosed space for quite a long time with people, and then why it doesn't have to be worn in shops, because you've got social distancing and people come and go. But schools are much more like the former than like the latter. So why they're not saying that teachers at least should be wearing masks, I've got no idea. So I'm seeing in the comments lots of people saying that their schools are providing masks, and then maybe it's voluntary for the staff to wear them or not. We think that if people want to wear them, they should be allowed to. Whether we have to go further than that, we're wondering about writing to the government, asking them to explore why they have this difference from between shops and public transport, and then don't draw the conclusion about schools to force them to try and say something about it. I think we're running out of time, and I've just seen somebody say that they've got a member of staff who lives with parents in their 70s, and they're being asked to come in, and they're worried about it. People in their 70s are in the clinically vulnerable group, according to the government. So it's anybody in their 70s. There's a list that the government has online, pregnant women, people with moderate asthma, diabetes, but people in their 70s are on that clinically vulnerable list. So our position is that we don't want those people. We want those people to be allowed to work from home. Maybe if the virus level drops away and everyone starts to feel more secure, maybe those could be the first people who come back from that working at home. But right now, if your 70-year-old parent gets the virus from you, they could have a very poor outcome, maybe being hospitalized for a long time. So we think protecting those people is an absolutely sensible place to be.
Thank you. And thank you very much to Mary and Kevin. And thank you for all the questions. If your question hasn't been asked, it has been logged, and we use the questions and we use the chat to form our own guidance and our information that goes out to members. I want to just repeat something very quickly. You get to see the frontline, very reactive stuff that the union's doing to government information that's coming out. But behind the scenes, we are working absolutely with people like Ofqual. We are looking at what education should look like. We are having conversations around, assessment for learning and how that should be out there as opposed to league tables and the various things that we've been fighting with for many years. So we have been looking at those. I want to finish by saying thank you. I hope that you found it helpful. Please put some comments into the box as to how we can help further. For you, it's to look at your checklist and look at your vulnerable staff and to work with your leaders to make sure that those people are protected. And there will be some difficult conversations. You're not being difficult. You're not being destructive. You are protecting your school and your school community, people that we love and care about, that we see normally every single day. The risk assessments are working documents and should be treated like this. So when different children come in, they should be looked at in those different ways. And by doing this, you are continuing to save lives and you are continuing to protect the NHS. The NEU has been on the right side of history and it's been difficult, but without you guys doing your bit in schools, we wouldn't have been able to do this. So thank you very much. Today's announcements was as much, and I'm not going to say the word victory because it isn't a victory because we all want our kids in school, but today's announcements, keeping people safe, was as much because of you as it was because of Mary and Kevin and the people that work for the NEU. Please log on if you want to for the secondary members so you can hear what your members are saying. But if not, thank you very much for your time.